The Harlem night breathed in whispers, a rhythm only its own could understand. Steam ghosted from manholes, catching the neon glow of a bar sign on Lenox Avenue, painting the wet pavement in strokes of red and blue. It was a cold that settled deep, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside a smoke-clogged backroom, far from the street's lifeblood, a different kind of cold had already taken root. Here, the air was thick with the stagnant confidence of men who believed their hate was law. 8 of them, draped in the arrogance of their robes, though they wore suits tonight. Their laughter was a sharp, ugly thing, a sound that didn't belong in this part of the city. They were an island of pale, sneering certainty, convinced their presence was an anchor pinning Harlem to its knees. Then, the door opened. No announcement, no gust of wind, just a change in the room's pressure. Bumpy Johnson didn't walk in so much as let the room receive him. He moved with a stillness that consumed sound, his shoulders carrying the weight of the city block, his gaze sweeping over the scene not as a visitor, but as a proprietor checking inventory. The laughter faltered for a beat, a momentary skip in a record of contempt. They saw a man, impeccably dressed, who brought the silence of the street in with him. They saw no weapon, no entourage, no threat. And in that, they saw a mistake. They mistook his quiet for concession. The laughter returned, louder this time, a forced and brittle thing. It was a performance for each other, a collective reassurance that the order of their world remained intact. The mockery began not with words, but with posture. A lean-back chair, a dismissive wave of a hand thick with cheap rings, a puff of cigar smoke aimed at the ceiling as if to obscure the very sight of him. They were frontiersmen in their own minds, claiming hostile territory with contempt. Bumpy Johnson stood by the door, his hand resting on the knob, not to leave but to own the only exit. He let their disdain wash over him, an ocean of noise against a cliff of silence. He didn't just absorb it, he measured it, cataloged it. He noted the man in the corner, the one whose laugh was a high-pitched bark, whose eyes darted to the others for approval. He saw the one at the head of the table, a heavy-jowled figure who held his whiskey like a scepter, his dominance built on the weak foundations of his followers' fear. Bumpy Johnson's stillness was an indictment. It held up a mirror to their frantic, insecure bravado. He took in the peeling wallpaper, the single flickering bulb overhead, the half-empty bottles sweating onto the scarred wood of the table. He was committing the scene to a ledger in his mind, not as a memory of an insult, but as an appraisal of an asset he was about to acquire. His calm was not passive, it was predatory. The air began to thin. The second-hand confidence that had filled their chests started to leak out, replaced by a creeping, unnamed dread. The silence between their jeers grew longer. Time itself seemed to bend to his will, each second stretching into a low, humming note of anticipation. Their world, so loud and certain a moment ago, was shrinking to the dimensions of this small, suffocating room. They had invited him to witness their power. They were only now beginning to understand he was here to collect it. His presence turned their mockery into a frantic, desperate act. They were burning the last of their fuel, their taunts growing more direct, more pathetic. They spoke of history, of entitlement, of a natural order they believed he was there to defy. Bumpy Johnson let the words hang in the air, letting their own ugliness poison the room. He did not defend, did not argue, did not correct. He simply watched. He watched them reveal their hands, their fears, their pathetic need for a world that bowed to the color of their skin. His lack of reaction was a void, and their hatred, poured into it, simply disappeared. They were shouting into a well, and the absence of an echo was more terrifying than any shouted threat. The temperature of the room had dropped, not from the winter outside, but from the absolute zero of his composure. He was a force of nature they had mistaken for a man. Their laughter had been a shield, and now, under the weight of his gaze, it had corroded into rust. They were exposed, their bravado flaking away to reveal the soft, frightened men beneath. They had wanted a fight, a brawl, a loud and satisfying confirmation of their own strength. They had expected target. Instead, they found a judge. The silence that followed their fading insults was a living thing. It pressed down on them, heavy as a tombstone. For a full minute, he said nothing, letting them stew in the acidic sweat of their own anxiety. The man who had laughed the loudest now stared at his hands, suddenly fascinated by his own cuticles. The leader at the head of the table shifted in his chair, the wood groaning under the weight of his unease. The confidence had not just drained, it had been stolen. Bumpy Johnson had taken it without laying a hand on them, a silent, effortless theft that left them poorer than they could comprehend. They were beginning to understand they were not in a negotiation. They were in a reckoning. The power they thought they held was a cheap illusion, a flickering projection on a wall he now owned. His silence was the sound of that projector being unplugged. It was the sound of their world going dark. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a weapon, but a tool. It was low, measured, each word carved from the quiet and placed deliberately into the suffocating air. "You came a long way," he said, his eyes moving from one man to the next, a slow, deliberate appraisal. The statement was simple, a fact, but in his mouth, it was an accusation. It questioned their judgment, their purpose, the very ground they stood on. He didn't ask what they wanted. He didn't need to. Their arrogance had already told him everything. "This block," he continued, the words spaced by long, suffocating pauses, "has its own rhythm, its own laws." He wasn't explaining. He was informing. He spoke of Harlem not as a collection of streets and buildings, but as a living entity, a body with its own circulatory system, its own heart. He was its guardian, its regulator. He took a single step into the room, and the collective intake of breath was barely audible but universally felt. He had breached their perimeter without a hint of aggression, yet it felt like a tactical maneuver, a flanking move that had trapped them completely. "Power," he said, his gaze settling on the man at the head of the table, "is not about the noise you make. It's about the silence you command." He reframed their entire worldview in 2 sentences. Their shouting, their laughter, their threats. He dismissed them as the tantrum of children. True dominance, he implied, was effortless. It was the quiet knowledge that your will would be done, not because you demanded it, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The men in the room exchanged nervous glances, their pact of arrogance dissolving into individual streams of fear. They had come to intimidate a man, and now found themselves being educated on the very nature of control, and they were the lesson. The air was thick with the chilling realization that they were not just in the wrong room. They were in the wrong story. They were extras in a film where he was the only star, and he was rewriting the script in real time, line by silent, heavy line. This was the beginning of the 7 minutes. It started not with a threat, but with a memory. I remember a man. Bumpy Johnson's voice was almost conversational, yet it held the weight of a eulogy. Opened a business on 125th Street. A tailor, good with his hands. Thought he could set his own terms. Ignored the advice he was given. He paused, letting the unspoken outcome of that story hang in the air. He didn't need to describe violence. He just needed to evoke its ghost. He was reminding them that history in this part of the city was written by him. Every storefront, every corner, every shadow held a story, and he was the author of them all. The men shifted, the narrative of the forgotten tailor becoming a parable for their own predicament. They saw themselves in that man's arrogance, in his fatal miscalculation. That was the first minute. The second minute was about reputation. He didn't boast. He didn't need to. His name was a currency, a brand, a law unto itself. "People in this neighborhood," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "they count on a certain predictability. They know the rules. They know who keeps the peace." He let the term hang in the air, a deliberate, chilling euphemism. Peace, in his language, was not the absence of conflict. It was the absence of unauthorized conflict. He was the authority, the only one sanctioned to permit or deny chaos. He was reminding them that they were an anomaly, an unauthorized disruption to an ecosystem he meticulously maintained. They were not just trespassers. They were a problem he was now obligated to solve. Their presence was a violation of his order, an insult to his control. By the 3rd minute, he turned their own mockery back on them, not with anger, but with cold, surgical precision. "You laughed when I walked in." Again, a simple statement of fact, yet it landed like a judgment. Laughter is for men who are comfortable, men who are certain. He let his gaze drift around the room again. "Tell me, he asked, the question soft but sharp as a razor. Are you comfortable now? He didn't wait for an answer. The silence was his answer. The sweat beading on their foreheads was his answer. The way they avoided his eyes was his answer. He had stripped their one weapon from them and revealed it for what it was, a flimsy shield of fear. They had laughed to convince themselves he was weak. His question forced them to confront the terrifying truth that he was not. The fourth and fifth minutes were an exercise in pure stillness. Having laid the foundation of memory, reputation, and consequence, Bumpy Johnson simply stopped talking. He stood, a monolith of calm, and let the pressure build. He let them drown in the silence they had once so carelessly filled. In this quiet, their minds began to race. They thought of the tailor. They thought of the journey back out of Harlem. They thought of the doors they had walked through so confidently, and how those same doors now felt like the entrance to a tomb. His stillness was a canvas, and onto it, they painted their own worst fears. He didn't have to threaten them with what would happen tomorrow. He simply made them understand that tomorrow belonged to him. The future of their businesses, their families, their very lives, now felt connected to the silent man in this room. He controlled the narrative of their future. The sixth minute was the final turn of the screw. He spoke again, his voice a near whisper, drawing them in. 7 minutes, he said. That's how long it took for the laughter to stop. He was narrating their own demise to them, holding up a clock that measured not time, but the complete erosion of their will. Think about that. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. He was forcing them to dissect their own humiliation, to understand the mechanics of their defeat. He wasn't just winning. He was teaching them how they had lost, ensuring the lesson was etched into their bones. The 7th minute was pure, suffocating silence. Not one of them dared to speak, to move, to even breathe too loudly. Their mockery, their confidence, their hatred, it had all been consumed. 8 men had sat in this room, certain of their power. Now, there was only 1 man and 7 ghosts, unable to speak, their voices stolen not by violence, but by the quiet, unassailable weight of his presence. When he was done, the room was a vacuum. The 8 men remained, but the arrogance that had defined them was gone, leaving behind hollowed-out shells of fear. Bumpy Johnson didn't offer a concluding remark or a final, gloating stare. There was no victory speech. Victory was a foregone conclusion the moment he had walked through the door. His purpose had not been to win a confrontation, but to restore an order they had dared to challenge. He had not come to fight them. He had come to erase them. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket, a small, precise gesture that spoke of a task completed, an item checked off a list. The room, which had felt like their fortress, now felt like his property, and they were merely unwelcome tenants awaiting eviction. He turned and walked toward the door, his steps measured and unhurried. The sound of his shoes on the worn floorboards was the only sound in the universe. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing. There were no enemies to watch, only defeated men. They weren't a threat anymore. They were a memory, a lesson. His power was not in the blood he could spill, but in the blood he chose not to. It was in the fear he could instill without raising his voice, the respect he could command without issuing a threat. He had walked into a room of loud, mocking men and, through sheer force of will, had turned it into a silent chapel of his own authority. The fear he left behind was a quiet, creeping thing, far more potent than the memory of a punch. It was the fear of consequence, the fear of a man who controlled the board so completely that he didn't even need to touch the pieces to win. He left them exactly as he found them, physically unharmed, yet fundamentally broken. He left them with the silence. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound as final as a gavel. Bumpy Johnson stepped back into the Harlem night, the cold air a welcome cleanse. The neon lights still painted the pavement, the steam still rose from the streets, the rhythm of the neighborhood continued, unbroken. Nothing in his demeanor had changed. He had faced down the agents of a century of hate, and had not so much as creased his suit. He had walked into their fire, and had not come out smelling of smoke. What happened in that room was not for headlines. It would not be a story told in newspapers, but a legend whispered on street corners, a piece of civic scripture. It wasn't about a victory over 8 men. It was a demonstration of a fundamental law. The law was that Harlem belonged to itself, and he was its enforcer. His power was not derived from violence, but from the promise of order. In a world determined to burn his community down, he was the man who controlled the fire. He built his legacy not on the graves of his enemies, but in the quiet, steady heartbeat of the streets he protected. He had imposed his will, not with a gun, but with a gaze, with a pause, with 7 carefully managed minutes. Bumpy Johnson didn't need them to fear him forever. He only needed them to remember those 7 minutes.